Welcome to the Even Better podcast, where your host, Sinikka Waugh of Your Clear Next Step, brings you exciting content about making communities better by helping people get even better at work.
Thank you for joining us today on the Even Better podcast. This is Sinikka Waugh, and I am so delighted that you're here joining us in a new topic today. I am super thrilled about this topic. Joe and I have been talking about this kind of back and forth for a bit now, and I am just anxious to hear what Joe's going to share with us, because this is stuff that I think will be immediately impactful for my life as well. And so I'm looking forward to this. I hope you as listeners are as well. Let me introduce you first to Joe Haibach. We have Joe Haibach sharing with us today 5 truths about fasting. And he and I have talked about this a couple times, that as he describes it, the healthiest meal you have can be the one you don't. So this is really interesting. I can't wait to see where this goes. We're talking about fasting today with Joe Haibach. And Joe and I met through one of my classes not long ago. We've been in a couple of classes together, actually. And in our classes where we were talking about project management or emotional intelligence or any of the other things that you all as listeners know I love to talk about, Joe and I got to talking about one of Joe's passions, which had to do with wellness and nutrition and human health. And so, Joe, I am so excited to have you with us today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Sinikka, I am delighted. Thank you for having me.
You bet. You bet. So for our listeners' benefit, things they ought to know about you. So although your current profession doesn't necessarily align directly to human health and nutrition, you have been interested in behavior for a while. You've been interested in health and in science. You've got a bachelor's degree in biology. You focused on animal behavior and have shifted your interest to human health and nutrition. And I think even some of the behavioral things, if I've got you right.
Yeah, that's right. If I could, I would be a lifetime student, go back into psychology maybe as well, and nutrition science, and maybe a dozen or so other majors and interests.
You bet. And I think, unless I'm speaking out of turn, and maybe you'll share more of this as we go, but you're not just speaking from the study of it and the science of it, but you've seen practical applications of what you're about to share today. You've seen it applied in your own life as well as those around you. Is that fair?
That's right. Since about June of 2019 of last year is when I started really looking at different ways of eating as I went back to the gym. And yeah, I've experienced a lot of what I don't want to say is theoretical, but it's the knowledge that's out there and the people who say, this is the way your body will be affected. And yeah, I've been able to confirm that. And I have some colleagues as well that have chosen some different ways of eating, gotten away from what we call the standard American diet, or SAD, the sad American diet is one way to think of it. And yeah, they've been able to apply that in their own lives for their individual goals.
You bet. Okay, excellent. When I think in the conversation that we were having, the part of what sparked this and why I said, oh, you got to come participate in our podcast is how it directly plays out to your wellness at work. So there's something about, and you're going to share some of this today, but there's something about your food consumption and your nutrition that has a direct impact on your ability to be effective and successful at work. Is that right?
Yeah, to me, it's really interesting. There's a lot of cognitive effects, and I mean, you can see it in all different ways. Behavioral effects, in just the frequency and the content of what you consume. So, I mean, it really is it's going to sound a little cliche, but maybe the fuel for our lives. And yeah, I've noticed a lot of different changes in my own behavior, and I would say emotional stability and just ability to concentrate throughout the day just by changing, when and what I ate.
Absolutely. So those 2 things right there are really key. And I think it's stuff that we talk about in our podcasts and in many of our classes, emotional stability and the ability to concentrate, the ability to focus. So that emotional stability, I teach a lot of classes, and our listeners are often interested in the idea of emotional intelligence and, that self-awareness and self-management. But it's more than a hack. It's not like, eating the right food at this particular moment will cause a particular response, but it's more like a nutrition habit that will cause you, if I'm understanding you right, that will actually impact your ability to self-manage in the moment in the everyday workplace.
Oh yeah, you're absolutely right. I don't know if you use the term hangry very much, but the hungry anger that people have,
Right.
and we laugh about it, but it's real. I think we've all been
Absolutely.
around someone that's like, they might just need a granola bar or something. But yeah, that's a direct result of the type of consumption that someone has. And you kind of touched on it a little bit. I hate to use the word or the term diet, because in our modern vernacular, it usually means, something that's done temporary, but through, schooling that I've had, a diet means, your environment or your long-term eating habits. So yeah, when I say diet, that's what we'll be meaning by that.
Yeah, it's not a 12-week program. It's your habits, it's your daily consumption and nutrition.
Exactly.
Awesome. Okay, well, great. So we're talking about truths that you might not need to know, and that might not know that you need to know. So truths about fasting. 5 truths about fasting in particular, and that's the topic. And so we'll hit each one of these one at a time, just guide our listeners through, and let's get right to it. So the first truth that you shared in advance, truths about fasting that people might not know. We get hungry based on 2 things. You said our schedule and our blood sugar. So we get hungry based on 2 things. Talk us through that, Joe.
All right. The 2 things, as you said, our schedule and our blood sugar. Eating in our modern Western culture is very according to the clock. It's 7 o'clock. That means it's time for breakfast. It's 12 o'clock. It's time for lunch, so on and so forth. I think a lot of people can identify with knowing what time it is based on what their stomach tells them. That's certainly not a foreign concept to us. What I looked at and thought or found interesting about that is the actual reasons why we do get hungry. And there's, again, that first one, just our circadian rhythms. Most people are familiar with that term as it has to do with sleep. But the second one is when our glucose or our blood sugar level drops, then that's when we start to feel hungry. I don't have a diagram, but if you think of a graph, a sharp drop off of your blood sugar is going to cause you to become hungry a lot more quickly than, say, a slow tapering off, a lot more gentler descent. So part of what you look at with fasting is just controlling that blood sugar rise and fall, and then being able to make it descend more slowly. So your body is just used to not having these huge hunger pangs anytime your blood sugar drops.
So the blood sugar dropping and the precipitous or the sudden drop of that, I'm picturing if it was one of those mornings that I had a donut for breakfast and then the donut was gone, right? Then I'm grouchy and I'm irritable because now I'm hungry because there's some sort of a very abrupt evaporation of that sugar that was in my system.
Exactly. Yeah. And I saw just on video here, I saw you moving your hand in a shaking motion, and that's almost what it seems to be doing to your body is, you put it perfectly. It's this abrupt change. And I've experienced the same thing. If I have maybe a couple of donuts in the morning, which I know I'm talking about healthy eating, but that's part of it is, you can change things up. You have a lot more leniency or a lot more flexibility with your diet. And yeah, I find myself, if I consume sugars, I'm hungry by maybe 10 o'clock. And yeah, I start to get a bit of a headache, and I'm hangry. I turn hangry. I don't want to deal with life as much.
Yep.
So yeah, it's exactly as you said.
Interesting. Okay. And the circadian rhythm makes sense, right? There's our sleeping and our waking cycle. So there is part of that's part of a natural cycle in there. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's fair. And our stomachs, or I suppose our perception maybe of where our blood sugar is. This is coming from me, not necessarily science, but our perception of where our blood sugar might be at a certain time of day is telling us that, okay, this is now triggering my hunger, or perhaps even the awareness of what the clock says. It gets our brain thinking about, okay, time for food, time to consume, and it becomes a regular thing.
Fascinating. So this is going to bring us to a second truth that you and I talked about, and that I just hadn't had a chance to really reflect on before I met you and before we had a chance to talk about this. So let's talk about your second truth there. It has to do with the 3 meals a day construct. So tell us what the truth is there.
Well, there is no science behind 3 meals a day being a healthy or advantageous way to eat. 3 meals is based on, as far as I can tell, it's a European or even an industrialized nation or culture concept, where when you're working in a factory, you do have to stop and eat and recharge. I've seen as well that part of being an agricultural society, if you're going to be working out in the fields all day, you would fill up on a large breakfast, you'd come in, have a large lunch, and then end it with large dinner potentially. When the Europeans came over to the New World back in the 1500s, the Native Americans were observed to simply eat when they were hungry. It was considered that they were very uncivilized because they didn't have these set meal times. It was just listening to their bodies and saying, I'm hungry now, this is what I will consume. And the same is true in there is, I forget the name of the tribe in Brazil, but they were studied in the same way as well. They had access to modern farming methods, and they could consume food more often than they did, but they didn't because they just didn't have the need for it. It was readily available through their existing means, and they ate when they were hungry, and they didn't worry about storing food or stockpiling or worrying about where their next meal was going to come from.
That is fascinating. Like even the phrase "they simply ate when they were hungry." Like how many of us
Right.
we just don't do that. We
Is
eat
that
because it's
novel?
right.
Yeah, it's time to eat. I either eat now or I won't get a chance to potentially.
Exactly. And I'm going to be gone for some number of hours, so I better load up my bag with the things that I'm going to need when I decide I'm hungry again.
Right. Yeah. And what I found is, and we'll talk about that a little more here in a few minutes, but yeah, it's essentially breaking that glucose dependency cycle that I talked about in our first truth. And, if you can get yourself off of that and train your body in a different way, and I think there's a lot of mental training as well, just training yourself to, I guess, I can't think of a better way to say it than to be okay with that, to be okay with not having to eat for another hour or two, but then also your body complying and agreeing with you and thinking, "Yep, I'm just not that hungry. I don't need food for the next 2 hours, and it's going to be okay."
Right. Decidedly, few of us in our modern working society here in Midwestern US, decidedly few of us are going to starve to death if we wait an extra 2 hours on our meal. It's just not going to happen.
Oh, exactly.
Interesting. All right. So this is all in the idea of fasting. And I know that as we continue to talk about this, you're going to evolve that idea of fasting for us and really flesh it out and what that looks like. But let's get to your third truth. So the first one we talked about, the two things that cause us to get hungry. And we talked about the construct of 3 meals a day being not necessarily natural. It's sort of coming from an industrialization. But let's look at the third truth. So the third truth, consuming less sugar. Now, if I just stopped right there, consuming less sugar, all sorts of us could end that sentence with all sorts of ways.
I was going to say, and we just lost half your listeners, I think. So.
Consuming less sugar. Wait, never mind. I'm out. So if you're still here and you're still listening to us, the rest of the sentence there, consuming less sugar makes it easier to eat less. What do you mean, Joe?
I know. Is that shocking?
It is.
Well, it's in part of that's kind of why I made number one about the reasons we get hungry. It's possible to train your body to when you consume food and your blood sugar level rises, because whether you're consuming sugar or not, you still get a rise in blood sugar because your liver converts these nutrients into glucose. Glucose is your blood sugar. If you're able to, again, make that cliff of a blood sugar spike turn in more of a hill and then not even climb as high, then you're able to have a lot more control over your hunger level, whether you realize it or not. So if you don't feel all that hungry, you generally aren't going to eat that much at your next meal or when your opportunity is to eat. You can avoid maybe a midday snack or a mid-morning snack because you had a good meal to start your day. Or perhaps it's like me, I don't even eat until 4 o'clock in the afternoon now or later. So I can have a cup of coffee in the morning and that satiates me for the whole rest of the day until sometimes I get hungry about 3 o'clock or so. But with my blood sugar being stable, with my body switching over to one of the big, I think, nutrition buzzwords now is ketosis. It's when you're using what are called ketone bodies for fuel now instead of glucose. And ketones are a lot more stable of, I don't want to call them a protein. I don't remember exactly what they're comprised of, but they're a much more stable, I'll use the term nutrient. And when you're able to switch your body over and get used to using ketones, then you essentially do have a lower blood sugar spike hill, I guess you would say.
Yeah.
Because you're being fueled by, in my opinion, what your body is meant to be fueled by, as opposed to this other type of fuel. To use the analogy of a car can be designed to use, a certain type of gasoline, and you're trying to fuel it all the time with something else, and that's causing a whole lot of health problems for your vehicle. So getting back to avoiding the sugars and allowing your body to switch to these ketone bodies as fuel is actually, again, getting your body used to running on the fuel that I think it's actually meant for.
Now that's fascinating. Do you have like examples of people that you can think of, anecdotally, experiences that you've seen where people have consumed less sugar and then they've seen a change in their eating habits?
Oh, yes, absolutely. A colleague of mine he works in law enforcement. I ended up having lunch with him last fall, and unbeknownst to me, he had decided in April of last year to start a much healthier eating regime. And he's not doing fasting, but he's eating more ketogenically. So he's avoiding excess sugars as much as he can.
Mhm.
He told me in October that he hadn't even eaten as much as a grape. And he's hardcore cutting out sugars, but his mood is good. He feels good. He looks good. And it's funny. He even said, he's like, I don't get cranky anywhere near as much anymore, because he feels good. And he was telling me as well that because he's been doing it for so long, that his body doesn't even have this desire for the junk food anymore. Like, he had an opportunity to eat a cookie, and he said he had the cookie in his hand and he just said, I don't even want it. So it becomes easier to avoid the things that you don't want. And I think we all know that we don't need or shouldn't have anyway, just the longer you stick with something like this. So it's what I've learned as well is there's a huge paradigm shift that has to happen, because or I think it's difficult to think about now. It's like, how could I be a person who, can't eat a plate of pasta, or who can't eat, 4 cookies around Christmas time, per meal almost. And it's, I liken it to, growing up, you think, how could I be an adult and do all these things that adults have to do? And you just sort of grow into it. And in my opinion, the less I really thought about it, the easier it became. It was, I'm going to have just a cup of coffee for breakfast, and that's going to tide me over, and I'm just not even going to think about it. So it has become habit.
Wow. So I love the idea of habit, and I kind of want to explore the fasting concept. I want to recover, so the listeners who left after we said consume less sugar. Now I got to make sure that the ones who just heard adulting means eating less cookies, but don't leave us. There's still some wonderful content to go. How did you get into fasting, Joe? What was it that made you decide that fasting was a thing to try?
Well, I stumbled upon it by accident. I am a frequent, we'll say, YouTube connoisseur. And I think I was looking for, as I was getting back to working out in the gym, I believe I was looking for workouts. And YouTube had a recommended video that it was something like, why I only eat one meal a day. And that person went into a lot of the details and the science behind why he started doing what he does. And he was experiencing a whole lot of the same things that we've talked about already, much more stabler mood. His energy levels are stable. He gets by with a lot less sleep at night too, or maybe not a lot less, but he's able to recover and function on less sleep when those nights happen. So to me, I thought, okay, I'll give that a shot. And for one, I'm a single guy, and one of my biggest, I would say, eating pet peeves was having to think about, what am I going to eat and make myself 3 times a day. And as I was just this level of frustration. I'm sure as a parent you feel the same, where it's like, okay, dinner tonight, all right, I got that out of the way. There's still 4 more days this week that I have to think about and take care of. So for me, it was a huge convenience factor, where I thought, okay, great, I don't have to eat and worry about making meals until I even get home, and they can be much simpler meals, whether it's just steak and vegetables. And to me, that was, a real eye opener. And it helped me as well, because I think common knowledge would always say, if you're hungry, or if you've heard about ketosis, a lot of times it's called starvation mode, which I think
Mhm.
is really a misnomer. And that's not really true at all. Starvation has a lot of different factors that go along with it. But again, for me, it was just the convenience, and almost the not being tied down to thinking about when I'm going to be able to eat next, or when I have to eat next. So again, I said it already, I have a cup of tea or a cup of coffee in the morning, and I know I'm set for the day. There's not anything I have to worry about. If maybe I don't eat till 6 or 7, I can handle that now, because my body is used to it, and it can handle burning the fats as fuels, which is what ketosis or ketogenesis actually does.
Right.
So it
Okay, so
certainly
that
helped me slim down, which is what a lot of other people experience too.
Yeah. So that gets us to your fourth truth, which is managing hunger when you're fasting can be as simple as a cup of coffee. So are you telling us really and truly that you have a cup of coffee and then you don't eat till 6 in the evening?
That's my day, yes.
So I can attest that in the times that you were in class, I did not witness you eating lunch.
Which is how we started talking about. I remember you looked at me after about 10 to 15 minutes during our lunch break and you said, "Joe, are you okay?" I said, "Are you referring to me not having food in front of me or something to that effect?"
Right, right. Everybody
Yep.
else had left for lunch or had opened up their lunch and were eating that to fortify for the afternoon. And you hadn't touched the candy on the middle of the table. You hadn't touched any of that all day. And here it was lunchtime, and you weren't eating anything. And it was so unusual. I had to go, "What? Are you okay?"
Yeah, it was such a kind thing for you to do as well. And that's what has actually been arguably one of the hardest parts for me, is just to try to explain to other people that might say, "Hey, what are we having for lunch today?" I'm like, "Oh, I don't eat lunch," or I don't eat until evenings. And they say, "What do you mean?" I say, "Well, instead of putting food in me, I don't put food in me, during the day." And yeah, it's I talked about a paradigm shift before, and just thinking that such a thing is even possible, I think is really difficult to do. And I was fortunately pretty open to that concept at the time, and I thought, oh, okay, I'll try it. And it's not too different from what I was already doing, which was maybe a Cliff Bar in the morning and then skipping lunch and then eating when I came home for dinner. So I had essentially, started myself off doing that already. I mentioned coffee and tea specifically because caffeine has been found to be a good hunger deterrent. Or, when you get hungry, sometimes
Hmm.
a cup of coffee is all it takes to, I don't understand or know the mechanics behind it, but the caffeine in the coffee, or perhaps even the taste or the flavor, as strange as that sounds, has a way of just dampening hunger.
Interesting.
And what some people will do as well is, just so that they can get some calories in them, is they'll put maybe a teaspoon of unsalted butter in their coffee. If you've heard the term bulletproof coffee before, that's
Hmm.
basically what it is. Or not basically, that is what it is.
Huh. I don't think I knew what bulletproof coffee was. Now I'm educated on that. So if someone decided that this fourth truth here is around, it's as simple, managing hunger is as simple as a cup of coffee, and I think I understand that. But when you talk about fasting, if someone were interested in fasting, I mean, does this mean you go days and days without food? Where do you start with fasting?
Sure. Yeah, and that can be a really tough and intimidating thing, especially with what I refer to as a glucose addiction. I know you and I have talked before about glucose, or sugar and cocaine activate the same receptors in the brain for pleasure, for
Correct.
one. There's a lot of similarities. We could talk, for hours more on just that, but it really is about, at least in my mind, it's breaking that addiction, and your body does become addicted to sugars. If you stop sugars cold turkey, you do go through the same types of withdrawal effects as you would from taking a hard addictive drug. So what I have read about, and what I ended up doing myself, is you can do that, or you can start fasting much more slowly. I mean, we all already fast when we go to
Mhm.
bed, wake up 8, 9 hours later if we're lucky. Then we've had an 8 or 9 hour fast. And then we have our morning break fast, is literally what the word breakfast means.
Yeah.
And we go about our day. So what you can start doing is just, you can eat the same thing for breakfast if you're able to do that. Sometimes maybe it's a little easier to start on a weekend because you don't have the workday to get in the way, but you can just push your breakfast back by an hour and then start doing that every day, or change up what you eat for breakfast, consume less sugars potentially, so that hopefully you'll be less hungry when lunchtime comes around. And you can just start spreading that time between not eating, from your nightly meal, and just take your breakfast until, like I do, at 4:30 p.m.
Wow.
And
So,
there
and
are
that's going to build us right into that fifth truth, which is that fasting has numerous positive effects. So, I think you've enumerated some, but by all means, repeat some of them. Let's talk about all the benefits of this idea of fasting, of breaking your fast later and later in the day. What are some of the positive effects, the benefits? Why should someone do this?
Sure. Well, I'll just add on that there are different types of fasting as well. You touched on it before. What I do is called a 16-8 fast. So I fast for 16 hours, and then I have an 8 hour eating window. Some people will eat one meal a day, where they'll devote an hour to their consumption of their daily calories. But what I looked at and some of the reasons that I started doing fasting for myself is what you had said already, is some of the positive effects. And what I've determined is that it appears that, and I haven't thought of a good analogy for this yet, but it appears that when our body is so busy digesting food, that seems to be our body's top priority at the time. So it's not able to do other things like self-repair, basically.
Mm.
There is something in biology, it's called autophagy or autophagy. It depends on how you pronounce it. And that is when the body does all of its cellular repair. So when you enter autophagy, that's when your bone cells are repaired, when even your brain cells are repaired, and your body just takes the maintenance time essentially to clean up and fix what needs fixed. That is cut way down during the times when you're digesting. So if you're able to wait to eat after, I think it kicks in between 12 to 16 hours maybe since the time of your last meal, then that's when your body actually starts to really ramp up its maintenance and perform all these tasks that it couldn't do before. So we would arguably, if we're eating 3 meals a day, I don't know if you can think of it as, cleaning your house. You're so busy doing all these other things that take priority over house cleaning, which, I mean, that's easy to do. But when you're able to, again, cut down on your consumption, then your body is able to then repair. And it's been looked at, or fasting has been looked at for, I don't want to use the term treatment necessarily, but for treatment of metabolic diseases such as diabetes. There has been evidence that fasting will help, again, through that repair process, will help with neurodegenerative disorders such as Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's disease, and just other brain or mental issues that often have to do with aging.
So by fasting, you're giving your body a chance to heal, to repair itself, to do the things that the human body was designed to do.
Exactly. Yeah, and the way I look at it is through human biology. Throughout the millennia, food wasn't always available, or generally wasn't available that we can tell. So there were times when people would, much like this Brazilian tribe that I talked about a few minutes ago, where they will eat maybe one time a day and then just not eat again until perhaps the next day at some point. And that reflects a very natural pattern that is seen or is suspected, throughout history as best we can tell, where, yeah, food is not always available, but even if it is, it doesn't seem like people would just constantly consume. So the body had always gotten that regenerative time and was able to essentially rest from this digestion process. That if food isn't available, when you get your hands on food, your body's going to see that as being incredibly important and does need to focus on the consumption of and processing of those calories.
That makes great sense. So, like, just thinking about the many benefits that you've talked about in our podcast so far, reasons someone might want to consider this. We've just ended on the idea of giving your body a chance to heal and to recover and position yourself for better health. But there's also there's the lessening of the complication of what on earth am I going to fix for dinner, like fixing all those meals of the day. That complexity decreases. You've got I imagine a grocery bill has got to decrease. If I'm not feeding 3 meals a day, I'm only feeding one. I assume that I'm not eating the same quantity in that one meal it's not like adding all 3 meals together, right?
Oh yeah, I'm definitely not eating as many calories as I used to, and I know that I'm still healthy. Whereas before it was, oh no, I'm only eating 2 meals a day. But there's also, with fasting or with eating 1 meal a day, it's looked at more on a long term, or maybe instead of a daily calorie intake, you look at it from a weekly calorie intake. So if we want to use an easy 2,000 calories per day, there are some days when I'll eat maybe just 1,200 calories because that's all I'm hungry for, or I'll make a smoothie or a shake, and I'll have that for a meal, and then whatever else I'll eat throughout that day. But then the next day I might gorge a little bit and eat 2,500 calories. So putting that or looking at that week long, I do know, after keeping track, I do know I'm eating a lot fewer calories by about 300 to 400 on average per day. So that's definitely helped me slim down. And yeah, my grocery bills are not necessarily what they used to be, except I'm buying a lot more red meat now because I've looked at other ways of eating. And I eat a lot more steak than I used to, so I'm certainly enjoying my meals more than I did for a lot of reasons.
Oh, sure. So we've got an impact on complexity. We've got an impact on immediate health. We've got the ability to trim down, and then the complexity of cooking, and possibly an impact on certainly on your enjoyment of your meals. Because if you're only having one, you're going to make it count. Then we talked about being hangry and the ability to be focused in an afternoon. Like I'm thinking about the afternoon meetings that I've had with people where they were legitimately hangry because they missed lunch for whatever reason. And so we could be a better, if our bodies were more used to that, we could be a better contributor to a great environment without that distraction.
Absolutely. I don't think it's foreign to anybody who after lunch there's the 1:30 or 2 o'clock slump, where your blood sugar has tapered off and is strongly on the decline now. And there's a lot of, I think, naps desired around the 1 to 2 o'clock time frame.
Right. The productivity that could increase if you didn't have that drop off that was so sudden, the volatility that would be eliminated, like we could be a little bit more even keel. I'm just thinking about all the things that distract us in the workplace from being our best selves. And I feel like you're absolutely hitting on some key points right here, that something like changing our diet to one meal a day would just really, really help us. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah. And what I like about it is sometimes I don't realize that it's even 1:30, 2 o'clock in the afternoon unless I look at a clock, because if you want to say my internal clock is not functioning in the same way, or it's going on a much longer scale between meals.
You bet. You bet. Well, we are at time here, so I want to wrap us up. But I never close without this nod to this question, because this is the Even Better podcast, right? So the question that I pose to you, Joe, is what is it that's making you even better right now?
This is a good, and it's an easy question for me, because I remember a few years ago I said, okay, I'm going to work on being better every single day, and in one way or another, whether it's read just a few pages of a book or just learn something new. And what I've been looking at lately is a lot about emotional health. I have anxiety and depression in my background, and I'm looking specifically and reading about the concepts of Stoicism and Taoism. Mm-hmm. And those are those are focused a lot on basically just being okay with whatever the universe brings. And it's a lot about self-acceptance and just acceptance of the way things are. And I've definitely noticed an improvement in my own mood. And you bring up the term emotional maturity. And yeah, there have been times when I have looked back and thought, I could have been really angry at that point, but I just said to myself, you know what? That's just the way that person is, or the way that situation panned out. And that's okay. It's been a real improvement for me to keep the molehills as molehills, I guess we'd say. And there's been a lot less mountains in the way.
Lovely. Lovely. What a great way to wrap that up. This has been a delighting and absolutely wonderful session with Joe Haibach. Joe, I appreciate your perspective here on fasting. And I know you're not just talking about it. I've seen you live this way. So it's a joy. Thank you for making time to come and share these concepts with our listeners today.
It was my pleasure, for sure. Thank you for having me.
You bet. And to our listeners, thank you so much for being part of today's podcast. Thanks for listening in. If you would like any more information about this, feel free to reach out to us and we'll connect you with Joe, or we'll get you more resources as you feel so inspired. So just let us know how we can help. And on behalf of all of us here at Your Clear Next Step, thanks and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you for tuning in today. The Even Better podcast will be back with more content soon. But in the meantime, subscribe to our podcast or check out our website at yourclearnextstep.com for more information. See you next episode.